know Jeff Dvorkin because he's a member of Massey College, and he taught for 10 years. He led the journalism program at U of T Scarborough, a very innovative program, both for future Canadian journalists and for the many international students that were part of that. You've seen in the program already that Jeff had some real adventures before he came to academe, maybe more than most of us. The list of countries that he had where he has worked and advised journalists is certainly a good one. Jeff's had some good titles as well in his career. He was called, I believe, the chief journalist for CBC, which is very nice.
I was flattered.
Yes, I think that's good. And it must also have been a very interesting job to be the first ombudsman for National Public Radio immediately after 9/11. And Jeff has continued to advocate and help organize and support other ombuds people. He continues to teach this summer at St. Michael's College in the media program, and has a number of blogs and other ways of communicating in the media. So I think we'll hear a very interesting session, and I look forward to it too. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Margaret, and thanks to everybody for inviting me here. It's been a long, strange trip. It has been, to quote the Grateful Dead. I mean, I started out as an academic historian, and there were no teaching jobs in history, so I fell into journalism as a second choice. When I was doing my doctoral work in London at the LSE, I worked part-time at CBS News as their overnight kid in the bureau, but managed to sort of see how journalism, American television journalism in those days was practiced. It was pretty impressive. Even though one night as I was snoozing on Charles Collingwood's couch in his office, I was allowed to do that. The windows blew in because the IRA set off a bomb at the department store across the street on the Old Brompton Road, on Selfridges, Harrods, thank you. So I had to go out there and sort of gather audio after the bomb, and I was thinking about how do you illustrate a bomb after it's gone off. And I had like a 50-pound Magra tape recorder that I was schlepping around. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just record my shoes walking through the broken glass. And that ended up on the morning news on CBS in New York. So thinking with your ears was sort of an early idea. The wanderings around were quite terrific. I had some great bosses, some great opportunities, got to do a little bit of nagging and teaching and cajoling in South America and the Middle East and Africa and parts of Eastern Europe at the end of communism. And then coming to NPR just before 9/11 was fantastic. And NPR became kind of, for me, a perfect model of how journalism can be done responsibly and respectfully. And then and I had a lot of opportunities to talk to international journalists who would come through Washington, especially even after the war in Iraq began. And I was often asked to, like this, sort of speak at a luncheon of gathered international journalists who were brought in by the State Department, given kind of carte blanche to wander around the United States for a couple of weeks and then come back to Washington to talk about it. This was during the Bush administration. The State Department under the Bush administration was very tolerant and generous in my experience. And I remember one luncheon where the war in Iraq was still going on, and we had a lot of journalists from the Middle East and from South Asia. And I was asked to talk about how we had covered the lead up to the war and the post 9/11 environment. And I said we did a lousy job. There was an anti-war movement. We didn't cover it well. We were very much intimidated by the vibe in America right after 9/11. NPR sent a reporter and crew to Tora Bora to talk to people who had set off the 9/11 events. And we were heavily criticized in Congress by that. But I think that was part of the deal. And it was very interesting to tell journalists from the Middle East and South Asia that even though we tried, we didn't do a very good job, that we were totally taken with the atmosphere of anger and recrimination. And any attempt we tried to make to balance that was met with a very strong rebuff. And I think that became part of the issue for me, which was how do you get to be an honest, open, responsible person doing journalism that serves the audience as citizens first, and then as consumers of information second. And that's still the challenge. So as I was telling this to this group of journalists, took some questions back and forth. It was all very companionable and felt very much in the moment, and that I didn't want to be defensive about American or North American journalism. And so, any other questions? And this older Pakistani journalist got up and said, "Yes, I have one question. I have been to your country. This is the first time. I have wandered your streets. I have seen your news organizations. I have only one question." I said, "Yes. Why do all your women look like whores?" And I said, "Well, you should see our whores." I said, "But the purpose of journalism is not to be proscriptive. It's to be descriptive." He allowed me to take a cheap shot, which I'm partial to. But it was really interesting to talk to journalists from other parts of the world about how we see the purpose of journalism. And when I got to Scarborough, which, as you may know, is a very diverse campus, and getting journalists, students of journalism, students in the journalism program, to think about what it is that we are supposed to be doing and for whom we do it. And I remember when I would start each class, first year students, 18, 19 years old, from all over the place, about 160, 170 students in the class. And so I would ask them, what have you heard today or seen or read or experienced in an information category that you found to be reliable? Long pause, and a young student from India said, "Well, I know what isn't reliable." I said, "Oh, really? What's that?" Said, "Anything from Pakistan." And a young woman from Pakistan said, "Well, everyone knows that the Radio India lies all the time." I said, "Okay, let's start from there." And so it became part of a process, which is to examine our own biases and influences. There's a wonderful book, a bit of a Bible for me, called Elements of Journalism by two people that I had the honor to work with and for and with, Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstein, The Elements of Journalism. And one of the things that they say is that a journalist coming into work in the morning must not leave their conscience at the door. You can bring who you are and what your experience is in order to inform your journalism, but not to deform your journalism. And that becomes the challenge. to figure out what stories affect you personally, how you would handle that, even though you may have to interview or talk to someone whose ideas you find abhorrent. How do you handle that? And I was saying at lunch that at the Toronto Star, just before the last election, they always have an editorial board. They invite the leaders of all the parties to come and talk on the record about their plans, their campaign, what they would do if they get elected, blah, blah, blah. And so they invited all the leaders, and they all showed up, Trudeau and O'Toole and Singh, and they invited Maxime Bernier. And when Bernier showed up, there was a boycott of that editorial board by younger journalists, mostly non-white or non-pink, as I'm told to say. And so this became a real issue. How do you handle someone whose ideas you find really abhorrent? Were you giving undue oxygen to Maxime Bernier just by allowing him to talk about his ideas? What is the purpose of journalism if not to explore ideas that you think are unworthy, but have some effect? And now we're seeing with the truckers demonstrations, some really appalling ideas that they are advocating and attitudes that are disgraceful. Yet, as a journalist, one would have to say, okay, I'm gonna have to talk to these guys and find out where their ideas come from. So for the last couple of years, I've been working on this book, Trusting the News in the Digital Age, because as we all sense now, that the media are no longer as trusted as they once were. There was a kind of Laurentian consensus back in the olden days of 10 years ago. You had a couple of broadcasters, you had a couple of newspapers, you didn't really have an internet, which allowed for the dissemination of some very odd ideas. Now, maybe this is a healthy thing. I haven't quite figured that out yet. That maybe these ideas were always there and we just didn't notice them because we were all sort of cocooned with the CBC and the Globe and Mail. So now we are in a different era, and the book, timing is everything in show business, as we say, that the book is actually kind of inadvertently very timely, because it tries to help certainly students, but I think the public understand that there are ways of discerning what constitutes reliable information and what does not. So what I'd like to do for a little bit is give you a taste of how I approach this with my class at Scarborough. And I asked them, what is journalistic truth? How do we know? And we go on, I mean, it's really interesting. They don't read newspapers, these young people. They never touched a newspaper. Newspaper ink never gets on their fingers. In the good old days when we had to wash our hands after we read it, especially a London tabloid. It was so interesting. And one time I brought in a couple of people who worked on newspapers, and they brought newspapers in and showed them, here's the inside page, here's above the fold, below the fold. They didn't know, they didn't care. That's not the way they consume information. So I had to kind of recalibrate and talk about, okay, if the first piece of information you get is when you turn on your computer in the morning, or you power up your iPhone, what are you looking for? And when you see something, how can you trust it? So that became the kind of the framework of talking about journalistic truth. So we step back a little bit, and I said to them, you've got an obligation as a journalist. It is to the truth, but what the hell is that? And I said, let's compare different kinds of truth, journalistic truth and science, scientific truth. Journalistic truth, it seems to me, is provisional. It is the best available information to that moment. And with the internet, that moment is constantly in flux. And if the story could change, if new evidence emerges, the story will change. But in order to present that information, there needs to be something called verification. When Reagan met with Gorbachev, he said that there was a Russian expression called trust but verify. And what I would say to my students was, turn that around. Verify, then trust. Figure out where the story comes from and how do you know if it's true. And the context is everything. After Hurricane Katrina, the Times-Picayune, great name for a newspaper, in New Orleans, they published a story that there were hundreds of dead people in a locker inside the arena that had died as a consequence of the hurricane. And they put that in the newspaper. And one of the things that never happened was the reporter who got this information from a member of the Louisiana National Guard. He never said, let's open the freezer. Show me the bodies. He never did that. And as a result, there was a story that was horrible, horrifying, and in a way too good to check. And the reporter, who was young, trusted the soldier, which was a mistake. And that became part of the lesson that I try to impart to our students. Open the freezer. Someone tells you something that sounds amazing. How do you know it's true? So how do we know? So one of the definitions for figuring this out is that the definition of news, timely information of some public interest that is shared through a journalistic process of verification. That verification is the most essential quality that makes journalism reliable. And that verification is done by an independent individual or an organization that is directly accountable to the public. And that becomes the challenge for us as consumers of information and for providers of information to give that kind of clarity and transparency so that that level of trust is augmented. Talk a little bit about epistemology. I don't have to explain to you, a sophisticated crowd like this, what epistemology is, but I would tell my students that it was the knowledge of knowing how do we know, which goes back to the Greeks. So there is a checklist that everybody needs to be aware of. I mean, sometimes these students will get an email or a message from their Uncle Fred. Gosh, this is so interesting. And it does look interesting, and you send it on to a number of friends. Everybody does that, even at a certain maturity. But until you have checked where it's from, you have to be skeptical. You have to remain at a certain remove from the story initially. One of the ways you can do this, I said to them, is there's an online journalistic checklist. At the bottom of any homepage online, there's something, little form that says about us. If that's not there, don't trust it. That about us is part of the effort at transparency that is essential. And you have to consider the information truly suspect if this website is not telling you who they are or where they come from. And there should be a method of contacting the news organization with an email, a mailing address, or phone number, so that they can be connected. Now, this is a problem now. because the digital environment has hollowed out news organizations to such an incredible extent. There are something like in Canada, 4,000 fewer journalists than there were a couple of years ago. That means that the quality of the journalism is going to change. It may in some cases be worse. What I call the low-hanging fruit of journalism is weather, traffic, and crime. And it's easily gathered. All three, weather, traffic, and crime, come from government sources. There's no great contextualization. And I think we've seen some of that with the trucker story. We're not actually we're starting to get more information. But when the story unfolded, whether it was in Ottawa or Coutts or Emerson or south of Vancouver, there wasn't a lot of context. There was just a lot of this just happened, this just in. The ability of any news organization to take a step back and say, okay, what's happening here and why is it happening? That has become much more difficult to do. The other journalistic checklist is who gets quoted in the story. And if the quotes are anonymous, why are they anonymous? Has the news organization given us, the audience, a reason to trust an anonymous source? There's a whole subtext, subculture of who gets quoted and why. You may have heard about Chatham House rules. Chatham House in London is the Institute for International Affairs. They invite political leaders to come speak to them. If they invoke Chatham House rules, it means that the journalists there can quote what was said, but they can't identify who said it. So and often I saw this in the States, that there were ways in which the reporter would telegraph, it was an ancient thought, would telegraph the idea of who they were speaking to. A high government official could often be the president. So there are ways of reading into these things, and the internet is actually really good at discerning who's being quoted and the origin of the story. We're seeing today in the New York Times the story about how CNN is falling apart due to a number of scandals. And the sources of this are being identified clearly, partly because people are no longer afraid for their jobs. Part of the willingness to talk to a reporter is, okay, I'll talk to you, but you can't identify me because if I do get identified, I'll get fired. So if the story is still that good and you can verify what this person is saying, you may have to, as a journalist, you may have to promise anonymity. But when you do that, and what I tell the students is, make sure that your boss or your editor knows that you've made that promise. Because if it has to be a promise that you can keep. Things have gotten much tougher in the world of political and the world of journalism in general. And we're finding that journalists who have promised anonymity to sources are getting jailed in the United States. Last time I looked, there was something like 60 journalists in the United States who were held in contempt of court, and many of them were jailed as a result by refusing to give up the identity of their sources. You may recall Judith Miller, who was working for the Washington Post during the weapons of mass destruction issue in the war in Iraq. And she was having an affair with Scooter Libby, who was Vice President Cheney's chief of staff. And he would tell her, pillow talk, that yes, we know that there are weapons of mass destruction. She would get that into the Washington Post, saying a source that I can't reveal says there are weapons of mass destruction. And then Cheney would go on the Sunday morning talk shows and say, well, I read it in the Washington Post, so there must be weapons of mass destruction. And she went to jail for 80 days and finally relented and said, yeah, I was having an affair with Scooter, blah, blah, blah. But it's just, I mean, the failure of the editorial control process of making sure that I occasionally still get asked by my former students, what do I do? I've got this information. Who should I tell before I put it in the newspaper? And I said, look, if you're working for a major news organization, they all have lawyers, and the lawyers are there for a good reason, to keep you from doing something or reporting something stupid. If you're a freelancer and you get this information, that's a bigger problem because there's no one has your back, and that becomes a problem. Any questions? Sorry, I keep going on with this, but I'm happy to be interrupted. Okay, I'll keep going. The second part of how do we know is who said it, and the way to check this, there are a couple of places. Snopes.com is a very good fact checker, and the Pew Research Center, pewresearch.org, also, you could send them a note saying, did so-and-so say this? And they will get back to you within moments and tell you, no, it's not true, or yes, it is true. They're really excellent to check out your sources. Look at the comments on the website. Now, it's interesting. David Carr, who was the media reporter for the New York Times, died a few years ago, told me, and he used this phrase in a couple of places. He said, the internet's wonderful. It's like a self-cleaning oven. If something wrong gets into the paper, the internet will correct it. So we don't need public editors or ombuds. Interesting discussion about that. But what the CBC has done recently, the last few months, is that it has a Facebook page, and it has stopped all comments about the CBC on its Facebook page, because the racism and the vile comments, the misogyny and the anti-Semitism posted on Facebook about the CBC was unbearable. And the CBC said, fine, we are not going to, we don't have the resources to moderate all these comments. We're going to cancel the ability of people to comment on Facebook about the CBC. And it's too bad, but I think they made the right choice. So look at the comments. If you're seeing that there is hate speech there, dismiss that website. It's not worth following. There's something called a reverse image. It's tineye.com, because there's a lot of photoshopping going on, so that pictures can get posted on, especially on a website, that are actually false. And there's a lot of that around. There's more than we realize. There's a reverse search on Google Images. You can click on reverse search, and that'll tell you where the photograph originated from, whether it's legitimate or whether it's been photoshopped. After the Fukushima nuclear disaster, there were a lot of pictures of deformed flowers, allegedly caused by the accident. No, none of them were true. It was just part of somebody wanting to raise the level of anxiety. Often if you go into an image and you right click on that, it'll tell you where the photo comes from. Students have a deep desire to be amused, but we have to understand, I would say to them, there's a difference between satire and fake news. Irony is a missing link on the internet. People don't understand irony. And there are a bunch of places where news organizations try to be hip and ironic sometimes. Now, there's a very good satire of the BBC. Some of you may have seen it. It's called W1A. Anybody seen that? Oh, it's fabulous. W1A is the postal code for the BBC in London. And they have sent up the BBC's wokeness and desire to be sensitive. It's feels a lot like the CBC. But anyway, that's just my opinion. But W1A, you should Google that because it's just, they did 3 seasons until the BBC said, okay, that's enough. So when journalists talk about the truth, the better news organizations have standards and practices, a code of ethics. NPR has a pretty good one. I wrote part of it, so I think it's all right. The Society of Professional Journalists has a very detailed list of what is the truth, and CBC News does as well. Getting back to this issue around science, I think that this is kind of valuable because journalism and science have a few things in common. Journalists want a pragmatic truth. That is to say, it's based in reality that can be measured. And it's not, it shouldn't be, sometimes is, but it shouldn't be ideological or political. And good journalism considers the public as citizens first, consumers second, as I've said. And its purpose, like science, is to make the world more understandable. I think part of the problem we've just come through or still going through is the issue around COVID. What constitutes a threat in a COVID environment? And we're getting all sorts of information, conflicting, information from politicians, from scientists, but it seems to be fairly confused. Again, this is my opinion, but I think the truckers have identified the fact that there's no single reliable source of information and that things are sort of all over the place. So how do we give the public, how should journalists give the public the information they need in order to make the right decisions? The masks are coming off, the QR codes are coming down. How do we know that this is the right thing? Well, some scientists say this is the right thing. Many politicians say we get it. We understand your frustration. The criticism of that attitude is that have the politicians capitulated to the truckers? We're all trying to figure this out. So the purpose of journalism should be to figure out what is verifiable as opposed to what is conjecture. And we're in a time when there is a lot of conjecture, certainly about COVID. Journalists and scientists do not believe in absolute truth. What we call truth changes. Journalists rarely consider a story to be over. If they do, they usually get hoisted on various batards. I myself was caught on an interesting one years ago when I was an editor on the National at CBC, and a very experienced, sophisticated reporter said, I've just come from the University of Toronto. There is a professor of medicine who has just discovered a cure for male pattern baldness. And those days I had more hair. And I said, oh, that sounds like a story. And we ran with it, and then only to discover that the good professor had just launched his own company of male pattern baldness fix-its. And he was just launching his IPO when we got taken. So bad for us. We should not have run that story. We should have asked tougher questions. We should have done more background research, but it was a story, as they say, too good to check. Now we know. Scientific truth is about probability, and it's only proportional to the evidence available. So that scientific truth, like journalistic truth, should change as the evidence changes. So the differences between science and journalism is that science is done under laboratory conditions, allegedly, except for male pattern baldness. And journalism is done on the run. Journalism is more about collecting field work, and there's always a risk of contamination in journalism, less so when the science is done properly. Who decides? This is also important. Expert peer reviews decide if scientific journalism is credible. It takes a long time. That's why the vaccines, the companies have said, we think we have a vaccine, but it's going to take us 4 or 5 months to figure this out. Whereas people are saying, come on, give us the dope sooner than that. Journalism is so much based on the moment. And so what the internet has done is that has given journalists a kind of excuse to go with what they know and correct it if it's wrong as quickly as they can, whereas science doesn't do it that way. And the old line is that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has time to put its pants on. And in journalism, that in the age of the internet, that is definitely a big problem. And the competitive quality of journalism means that people will want to get it out there first and then use the internet to correct it if it's wrong, which is not, in my opinion, a real service to journalism. But that competitive edge really forces everyone to be overly competitive. So how do we know, and what's the truth? If it's true, if something is true, why does it change? Because the stories always develop. There's no final or definitive journalistic truth, but there is a version. And so we look at a story and we say, okay, what's going on in Ottawa today? Are they moving the trucks off of Parliament Hill? Someone's saying yes, someone's saying no. How do we know? Who is telling us the story? So the question, the challenge for journalistic organizations is, should we go with what we know now, or should we hold the truth until we can verify it? And that's the constant dilemma, which the internet, the World Wide Web, has made even more worse, more damning. And so we have a lot of wrong information out there. Is the wrong information spread inadvertently or deliberately? And yesterday, a judge in New York and a jury in New York said that the New York Times is not liable for defamation of Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin accused the New York Times of maliciously propagating a story that she was encouraging assassinations of Democratic candidates. And the Times admitted, yes, they made that connection and it was wrong, and they corrected it right away, that their intent was not malicious, it was the pressure of competition that had them do that. And so both the judge and the jury threw out the claim that the New York Times was liable. The big case that guarantees press freedom in the United States is a case that goes back to the 60s called Sullivan versus the New York Times. Sullivan was a sheriff in Alabama. The New York Times published a full-page ad from a group of Black ministers blaming the sheriff for perpetuating violence. The sheriff said, I did no such thing, and sued the New York Times for defamation. This went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, in the case of Sullivan versus the New York Times, Sullivan is wrong, not because what the Times published in an ad was right, but because the Times didn't intentionally mislead the public. They did it without malice. They made a mistake, but it wasn't malicious. And that has become the definition of whether a news organization should be held responsible for misinformation or disinformation. Misinformation is when your Uncle Fred says, I was in Scotland, I saw the Loch Ness Monster, and here's a picture. And you send that to Aunt Hilda, and she says, oh, that's not malicious. That's kind of sharing a common bit of absurdity. However, if you spread the word on the internet that Dvorkin gave a speech at the faculty club, and we saw him take the silverware and put it in his pocket, and suddenly I couldn't get my teaching job at St. Mike's was canceled as a result of that, I'll sue the bugger who did that. And I think that it's that malicious quality that we now see in so much in the media. It's just it's so easy to do. And the issue around algorithms and the gathering, the harvesting of information is now so easily done that you can spread disinformation very easily to very good effect. A number of bloggers in Macedonia put out stuff about Hillary Clinton for the 2016 election, complete fabrication. It was malicious and stupid, but it worked. And the Trump people saw how well it worked, and they started to do that as well. Maybe not quite as viciously as the teenagers from Macedonia, but they did a lot of it. And I was saying at lunch that there was this picture that was targeted to people of a strong religious bent in the Midwest, with a cartoon of the devil wrestling with Jesus. And the devil was saying, I want Hillary Clinton to win. And Jesus was saying, no, she will not. And okay, stupid, primitive, very unsophisticated, but in tracking this down, 10% of the voters in a couple of Midwest states said, yeah, I saw that and changed my mind and I'm going to vote for Trump. It doesn't take much, because it's this idea of, there is this fellow in the Midwest in Michigan. His name is Overton. And he came up with this idea of something called the Overton window. Anybody hear of this? It's a really interesting idea. Overton said that you could introduce an idea that is so antithetical to proper thinking and introduce it on the internet. The first time people will say, well, that's ridiculous. But then you introduce it a second time and people will say, well, I've seen that before, so maybe it's true. And then you introduce it a third time and people start to believe it. So for example, Overton and the Mackinac Institute, which is quite a conservative think tank in Michigan, wanted to abolish public funding of public schools in the state. And they wanted private education, the kind of schooling that is done by small corporations. So they started to introduce the idea that public education is both a waste of money and is wrong. And the first time it was introduced in Michigan, they said, that's ridiculous. Everybody believes in public education. By the third or fourth time it happened, the Overton window, which was pretty small for the idea of canceling public education, suddenly that window became larger. And more people believed it. So that the repetition of what initially may seem to be an outrageous thought in the scheme of the Overton window eventually has a certain level of credibility enough to influence people's voting habits. Pretty amazing. So this is where context is everything. Context is defined as the facts that surround an event or elements of a news story and provide proportionality, meaning, significance. Because news without context, in my opinion, is not news. It's just stenography, really. So here's where we're going to end up. We have a lot of arguments in the media about what's fair and what's balanced. And Fox News would say, we're fair and balanced, the implication being nobody else is. If you drill down into that, the difference between fairness and balance is quite significant. Fairness presents the news in context. There's some elements of the story that are important, others are less so. It's giving all sides an opportunity, and it allows people to choose which elements are worth including. Balance is not about being fair. Balance is about even-handedness. Stalin, Hitler, you decide. That's balance, but it's not fair. And so it's not about context, and but it is about letting the public make choices. But often the illusion of some kind of equality is a disservice to the public, and it's certainly not necessarily good journalism. So I'm going to leave it there.